Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I am thrilled to have so many old friends here and to meet new people. So thank you so much, even more because it's a Saturday on the holiday season. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us. Thank you so much also for Professor Almazan for all his kind and thoughtful help during this time with my research. And also thank you so much to Okabe Sensei, to Sano Sensei, and to Pablo Martí Sensei for because of their advice during this month that has helped me to improve my research. So thank you so much. And I will start sharing my research about identifying community places by mapping subjective perceptions with a case study on Tokyo peripheries. So this is the flow for today's presentation. So the thesis is focused on the Tokyo metropolitan area, which is the urban agglomeration of 4 prefectures, Tokyo, Kanagawa, Saitama, and Chiba. And first, we will go for an introduction block and a first chapter about the background of the thesis, where I will explain about how metropolitan growth leads to urban sprawl and the lack of formal community spaces in the peripheries, and how this process is aggravated by suburban shrinkage. Then in the second chapter, I will explain the preliminary territorial analysis of the Tokyo metropolitan area peripheries. And then in the analysis block, I will map user perceptions to find community places in 2 case studies. One is Chōfu in Tokyo Prefecture, where we will see the perspectives of visitors and stakeholders about places perceived positively and negatively. And the other one is Minamiashigara in Kanagawa Prefecture, where we will check the perception of place about local stakeholders. Then in the last block and in the last chapter, I will go for the discussion and conclusion, pointing out the type of space that we map and their potential vulnerabilities. So let's go for the first block and the first chapter of the background. So after the Second World War, the urban growth, the economic growth, and the demographic growth is concentrated in what we call metropolitan areas. So metropolitan areas are urban agglomerations of 1 or more central cities and their peripheral surrounding towns, over which the central city exercises a commanding economic and social influence. So actually, 1/3 of the total global population is concentrated in these 1,900 metropolitan areas around the globe that you can see here in this map. And this process is expected to even increase in the following decades. So by 2035, more than 1 billion people, which is more than 50% of the total global population, will live in metropolitan areas. So this metropolization process leads to what we call suburbanization, which is the rapid expansion of metropolitan areas to the peripheries, and it's a process entailing many economic activities and residents moving from the center of metropolitan areas to the suburbs. So during the 20th century, the business-oriented city centers were labeled as dangerous and crowded, while metropolitan peripheries were considered extensive and uncongested car-oriented places and a safe realm for developing domestic life. So actually, only one small portion of the population lives in the center of metropolitan areas, while the vast majority of its population lives on metropolitan peripheries. This urbanization process and the expansion of residential areas dominated by private vehicles over rural land leads to what we call urban sprawl, which has different kind of landscapes, as you can see here in different contexts, but in all cases is characterized by a low density pattern and an urban fabric dispersed and scattered in the territory. So urban sprawl, even if it is considered a safe realm for developing domestic life, has several inherent issues, and some of these issues are environmental, like the inefficient use of resources or the increasing pollution due to car dependence. Some of them are health-related issues, like the risk of exclusion of the population that cannot drive from the health services, and some others are social, like the apparent lack of traditional community spaces in these areas, and therefore the lack of social interaction and social involvement on them. So in Japan, this urbanization process is very linked to the development of the railway infrastructure. So in fact, at the beginning of the 20th century, the railway and electric corporations bought land around the stations and railways that they were building and developed it into urban land and sell it to the emergent salaryman class. So you can see here the most known and published example of suburban development in Japan, which is the Denen-Chōfu area developed by the Tokyo Corporation before and after its development. So in this case, this suburban development follow a very clear garden city approach, very similar to those proposed by urban planners in Europe and American context at the end of the 19th century. And although other suburban developments in Japan has not a so clear garden city structure, they share the same principles in most cases. So most suburban areas concentrate their planning efforts near to the station in order to attract the maximum number of commuters. So while in those faraway areas, there is not so urban growth strict control policies. So this lack of growth control and the popularization of private vehicles in the 60s and in the 70s leads to these far away areas to develop urban sprawl. So we can find these urban sprawl situations mainly in those areas located between the railway transportation lines. So while the areas near to the station have several services and have community places, this kind of places and structure is more scarce as we move far away from the station's area. So when I speak about formal meeting facilities, about formal community places, normally what comes to my mind is this kind of monumental, large public spaces that we can find in most European contexts, like the Greek Agora or the Italian Plaza. But the truth is that there is a scarcity in Japan of this kind of monumental places because of historical reasons. But in Japan, in most dense and central areas, we have another kind of formal meeting facilities that support the neighbor social life, like community centers, libraries, cultural halls, auditoriums. But while these kind of facilities are common in the dense urban cores, this is not so in the peripheries, which are considered to lack this kind of community places and therefore social involvement. So these inherent problems of urban sprawl are aggravated by another development trend, which is suburban shrinkage. So where in the 20th century, the majority of countries were undergoing population growth to a larger or lesser extent, in the 21st century, the tide has changed, and now more and more countries are stagnating and losing population. So the metropolitan peripheries that were considered in their origins in the 20th century, the antithesis of urban decline, in the 21st century are the ones who are undergoing most of the population losses and are facing serious demographic challenges. So Japan is a paradigmatic example of this change of tide. So it's a country that experienced a high population growth in the 20th century, so it increased its population almost by 50%, but during the 21st century is stagnating and is decreasing in population, and this process is expected to aggravate in the following decades. And although we think that urban decline is something limited to the peripheries of the country, the truth is that it is also affecting the most populated metropolitan areas in Japan, like Osaka and also Tokyo. So, in this thesis, I seek to identify the community places in metropolitan peripheries in order to challenge the preconception of these places as areas lacking community places and therefore social interaction and social involvement. The challenge is that mapping these kind of places through traditional approaches like land use analysis or typomorphological analysis can be quite challenging. So I seek to map these kind of places in these urban sprawl complex areas by mapping subjective perceptions of users to place. As I note, I focus on the Tokyo metropolitan area, which is this urban agglomeration of these 4 prefectures, and I perform a preliminary analysis and 2 case studies on Tokyo peripheries. So the research question is, can subjective perceptions be used to visualize community spaces in metropolitan peripheries? And the significance of the research is threefold. First, theoretical, since it wants to identify the kind of community places that support social life in the metropolitan peripheries and fill that gap on the literature. Also methodological, since it wants to check the suitability of subjective perceptions to map these kind of places and complement traditional approaches. And also practical, since it wants to offer specific insights and information of researchers and urban planners working in the Tokyo metropolitan area and also in the 2 case studies. So the preliminary analysis that I perform is based on 5 open data bases, which I retrieve information to prepare 6 maps and check the characteristics of the Tokyo metropolitan area peripheries. And later, the case study analysis is based on mapping subjective perceptions of users to place in 2 cities of the Tokyo metropolitan area. So by subjective perceptions, we mean the intuitive and unconscious interpretation that a user makes about a particular space. So we have several factors to map subjective perception, but in urban research, we mainly use two of them. The first is place attachment, and the second is place identity. So place attachment refers to the cognitive bonds that users and communities develop with specific places as they get to know and value them. And place identity is usually considered a component of place attachment and refers to the settings, activities that differentiate one place from others. So place identity is also a dynamic factor which combines self-perception and outside perception. And to map this subjective perception, we have mainly two kind of tools, which are cognitive and evaluative maps. So cognitive maps were developed by Kevin Lynch in the 60s, and they focus on representing the city imageability. That is, those elements and places in the city that the user retains in their minds. So you can see here one example of these kinds of maps in the Boston image map developed by Lynch from the interviews and workshops with the participants. And the other tool are evaluative maps, which were developed by Nassar in the 90s and represent not only the city imageability, but also its likability. That is, how users perceive as positively or negative the places and elements in the city. So you can see here one example of these maps by Nassar about Knoxville in Tennessee, where he is mapping how people perceive these places in the city as most liked or more disliked. So this research is inspired by these two kinds of maps. And it wants to fill the gap in the literature in these two fields, mapping subjective perceptions and studies on community spaces. So, as I note, cognitive maps were popularized in urban research by Kevin Lynch in the 60s and also by other researchers as Brody, who mapped the native Canadian settlements in his book, and also in the mental maps by Gould. Later, Nassar popularized evaluative maps in urban research, and later researchers popularized how to use visual caption methodologies to gather subjective perceptions. That is, how to use, for example, pictures and captions to gather the user perception to place with works like the one by Sano or visual methodologies by Rose. So this kind of approach will be very relevant for the first case study in Chōfu City later. Later research focused on how to map subjective perceptions of place from local stakeholders through fieldwork and workshops. So we have here, for example, the work by Sano, also by Sepe, or the diverse subjective atlas developed by Devet. And later trends on this field are mixing machizukuri, what we mean Japanese community making, with mapping subjective perceptions. So we have works like the one by Walking and Mapping the City by Yamano, also the one by Sato, or the diverse books developed by the Tegakichisu group. Regarding on studies on community spaces, the Japanese local researchers in the 60s and in the 70s studied the particularities of Japanese formal and informal community spaces and how the individual subjective experience of place was a particular component of informal places. Later, the work by Oldenburg popularized the term third places as those different from the living environments and the working environments. And then the work by His popularized the concept of sweet spot as those places particularly attached by the community that need special care and maintenance. So these works, together by the book by Chase, were the base for developing what we know as everyday urbanism, which focus not in the city's most well-known landmarks, but in those spaces that support the resident everyday life, even if they appear to be ordinary. So we have here the works by Jarvis, also the research on New Orleans informal places by Toulouse, also the one by Klinenberg, where he developed the concept of social infrastructure, etc. So the two case studies that I will present are relevant since they are examples of this kind of suburban development in Japan linked to the transit infrastructure. So the Chōfu area was developed by the Tokyo Corporation mainly, while the Minamiashigara urban area was mainly developed by the Izu Hakone Railway Corporation. So, as I noted before, these corporations focus their planning efforts near to the stations of these railway lines while neglecting to a lesser or larger extent those far away areas. And this tendency, this duality between very planned areas near the railway lines and the stations, and this neglection of urban planning in faraway areas continue with the municipal plans and the master plans from the 60s to the 90s in both case studies. So they mainly focus in these areas near the station that you can see here on the right. So the last plans that are facing population decline are still focusing on areas near the station, but they are also trying to comprehend larger areas of the territory. So they are trying to address also other areas that were neglected in the past in these approaches. So with this, we finish the first chapter of the thesis background, and we move to the preliminary analysis and visualization of the Tokyo metropolitan area peripheries. So the Tokyo metropolitan area is the most populated metropolitan area in the world. It has around 37 million people with 23 special wards that revolve around the Yamanote line that you can see here, and 119 cities, and it has more than 12,000 kilometers. So in this chapter, I will retrieve data from 5 sources to develop 6 maps in order to identify the characteristics of the Tokyo metropolitan area peripheries. So the first map is the official definition by the Statistics Bureau of Japan, which consider peripheries only in terms of distance to the Tokyo urban center, but it does not consider other parameters like newness or density. So we have to complement this definition with other kind of information. The second map analyzes the urban expansion of Tokyo by comparing the data of densely inhabited districts and allow us to differentiate between 3 areas. Those historical areas that you can see here in yellow, which were developed before the 60s, those areas that were developed during the high economic growth in Japan between the 60s and the 90s that you can see here in orange. And during this period, the surface of Tokyo increased more than 200%. And the third kind of areas that you can see here in blue are those corresponding with the stagnation period from the 90s to 2015. And in that time, the surface of Tokyo only increased 5%. So the next map addresses the characteristics of the Tokyo urban fabric by retrieving data from the Satellite Information Program of the European Union. And this map represents in a 10 per 10 meter grid the building surface and heights and the mainland uses. So this allows us to check how most high-rise developments are happening in the center of Tokyo, or especially in the center of the Yamanote line, while these streams of medium-rise residential developments are going from the center to the outskirts of Tokyo. And also how between the railway transportation lines, we have these in-between areas that are mixing low-rise developments with agricultural land. So these are perfect examples also of urban sprawl. The next map is about the population changes in the Tokyo metropolitan area by comparing the census data between 2010 and 2020. So this allows us to check that from the 22,000 districts of Tokyo, 30% of them are growing, particularly those situated in the center of Tokyo and the Yamanote line here, while 17% of them are stagnating, especially those located in the 23 wards and around the Yamanote line, while the remaining 53% are losing population to a greater or less extent. So those ones located in the outskirts or the metropolitan area are losing more than 30% of its population in some cases. But urban decline is not only limited to the outskirts of Tokyo, and is also appearing in central areas like the Adachi, Katsushika, and Edogawa ward. And this duality between growth in the center and decline in the outskirts is also going to continue in the following decades. So by comparing the census data between 2020 and 2050, we can check how these areas will still be gaining population in the future, while the outskirts will still be decreasing up to 20 and 30% in some cases. The last map addresses the population changes between day and night time, and this allows us to see how the center of Tokyo is serving as a working hub where population is going to work during daytime regular working hours. So the population of some districts is increasing more than 500% in some cases, while those located near the 23 wards, and especially those located between the fringe of 10 and 30 kilometers from the center of Tokyo, are losing population during the daytime, and they are serving as bedroom towns, which population is commuting to the center of Tokyo for working during the day. So this can pose an additional population challenge for those cities located between 10 and 30 kilometers from the center of Tokyo. So by overlapping the information in all of these maps, we can distinguish between two kind of different areas, different peripheral areas in the Tokyo metropolitan area. So both types of areas were mainly developed from the 60s to 2015, but apart from that, they have several differences. We have the inner peripheral areas, which are located between 10 and 30 kilometers from the Tokyo center, that have mainly a medium-rise urban fabric, and most of them are stagnating, although they are projected to lose population in the following decades. And in the other hand, we have the outer peripheral areas, which are located farther away than 30 kilometers from the center of Tokyo. They have a low-rise urban fabric in their majority, and most of them are stagnating and declining nowadays. So in the next chapters, we will check two case studies, one per each type of area. First, the case of Chōfu in Tokyo Prefecture, which is an example of inner peripheral area, and then the case of Minamiashigara in Kanagawa Prefecture, which is an example of outer peripheral area. So with this, we finish the introduction block, and we move to the next block of the analysis and the case study of Chōfu City in Tokyo. So as I note, Chōfu is an example of inner peripheral city and is quite known for having the second oldest temple in the Tokyo area, which is the Jindaji Temple. It's a city that has a huge number of commuters, so almost 50% of its population daily commutes to the center of Tokyo for working and studying. And this city underwent high population growth, so from the 20s to the 60s, its population increased around 7%. And in 2020, it had around 240,000 people, and it's expected to peak in 2028. And from there, it will start declining. So up to 2050, it will lose around 9% of its population. So this case study focuses in the area between the Chōfu station and the Jindaji temple in order to find the places that are supporting community life in this area. So in order to do that, we developed what we call the identity building method that seeks to recreate the process of place identity between self and outside perception by combining the subjective perception of local stakeholders and visitor participants. So for do this, we develop this method with a series of steps. First, we perform a historical analysis through historical and GS maps, and from there we develop a typological analysis that allow us to differentiate between four areas for fieldwork here. So we invite a total of 12 foreign visitors to walk around these four areas and take pictures with their smartphones and a journalist application called Day One about 3 places perceived positively and 3 places perceived negatively per each of these areas. Then we classify all of that information and use it to trigger interviews with 12 local stakeholders and ask them also to point out 3 places with positive characteristics and 3 places with negative characteristics per each of these areas. And with all of that information from foreigners and local stakeholders, we develop evaluative maps of places with positive and negative characteristics for this research area. So you can see here some of the pictures of the fieldwork with the foreign visitors. And regarding the foreign visitors, we invited a total of 12 people from Africa, Asia, and Europe that were living less than 2 years in Japan. And here also some pictures of the interview with the local stakeholders. And we interview a total of 12 people carrying out a wide range of activities like fire brigade, youth association members, members of the local council, soba restaurant owners, priests, etc. So, for the fieldwork with the foreign visitors, we obtained a total of 323 photographs with their captions, and 200 of them were about places with positive characteristics and 100 of them about places with negative characteristics. And we used this map and all the pictures that we obtained to trigger conversations with the local stakeholders about the places in the city. So regarding the evaluative map of places obtained through the visitor perspectives, of course, the visitors highlighted positively many touristic places like the Fudaten Shrine, for example, or the Jindaji Botanical Garden, but the visitor participants also highlighted positively some places that normally were overlooked by local officials and the local stakeholders, like for example, some handcraft shops, also some flower shops in the area, and especially some urban patterns like urban farms that were very positively considered by the foreign visitors and are inserted in the urban fabric of the research area. And also, since the foreign visitors were very sensitive to the maintenance of the urban fabric, they mark as positive a lot of places that were well maintained, like places, houses with a good appearance, that were well maintained, with very Japanese looking and well maintained private gardens, etc. And because of this same sensitiveness to the maintenance of the urban fabric, the foreign participants mark as negatively also a lot of places that were lacking maintenance, houses that look abandoned, places that have maintenance problems, etc. So from this evaluative map from the visitor perspectives, we obtained two main findings. One was to check some places that were overlooked by locals but highlighted from the visitor perspective. So a total of 23% of the places highlighted by the visitors were not highlighted by the locals. And for example, we have this kind of urban farms that the visitor perceived very positively because it was an opportunity to interact with local people. And they found 4 places of this kind highlighted by 7 respondents. And also this kind of handcraft and flower shops, which highlighted 7 respondents that were also perceived positively by the participants. Thanks to the visitor perspective, we also managed to locate abandoned spaces and buildings in the research area, and we located a total of 6 spaces, including akiya in Japanese abandoned houses, abandoned shops, and abandoned areas, highlighted by the totality of the respondents. So, regarding the evaluative maps from the local perspectives, the locals also highlighted some touristic places again, but they highlighted positively especially those places that they have a special attachment to and that were useful for them to connect with other people. So as example of this, we have the Niiwai no Sato market in the center of the area, for example, and also the Yokocho, the narrow bar alleys near the station. That they also highlighted several places with negative characteristics, because even if these places were relevant for the community life, they have several issues, and the main one of them was that they were perceived as dangerous since they are close to roads with high speed traffic, with roads that lack pedestrian areas and that are not enough illuminated during the night, etc. So from the local perspective, we made one main finding, and that was to check that this kind of ordinary everyday community places were valued by the local respondents even above the city's most well-known landmarks. So examples of this kind of apparently ordinary places that support everyday life are this kind of bar alleys near the station, highlighted by 4 respondents, this kind of Niiwai no Sato market in the center of the area, highlighted by 3 respondents, and also these spaces under the highway that, although they have a difficult access and they have several dangerous elements in some points, they have also in some areas playgrounds that are supporting the surrounding neighborhood and become very lively with children and their parents. So 3 main findings that we made through this case study. One of them is methodological and the other 2 are practical. First was to check the usefulness of the visitor perspectives in order to find overlooked places like the urban farm that I was mentioned and also the handcraft shops in the research area. And also the usefulness of the visitor perspective and their materials to trigger conversation with the local stakeholders. Because Chōfu is an inner peripheral area, and abandonment is not still generalized and is not still in the mind of the overall user, the visitor perspective acts a bit like the canary in the coal mine, in the sense that allow us to discover and check which spaces and buildings are abandoned before the situation reaches a critical point in the area. We also discover some everyday places that are rooted in the community that, although they appear to be quite ordinary, they are especially attached by the residents over the most well-known landmarks. So these kind of spaces resonate with the concept of third places developed by Oldenburg and the concept of switch places developed by His and Toulouse. We also check some of the issues that these kind of spaces face, and in the case of Chōfu, these issues are related to the low accessibility because they are located close to roads with high-speed traffic, with to roads without pedestrian access, etc. And also, other issue was the lack of maintenance due to the decreasing resources in the city. So, with these findings, we finish the case study of Chōfu, and I move to the next chapter about the case study of Minamiashigara in Kanagawa Prefecture. So Minamiashigara is a outer peripheral city that was developed around a single type of industry called Fuji Xerox that you can see here in the background. And it's a city that also underwent high-speed population growth, and its population increased at 220% between the 20s and the 60s. And its population peaked in 2001 with 44,000 people. And from there, it has been decreasing. So in 2020, it had around 40,000 people, and it's expected to decrease an additional 30% up to 2050. So the negative consequences of decline, like abandoned houses, abandoned shops, are appearing in all the city. And our objective here, again, is to check which kind of community places are supporting the social life of the residents. So for doing this, in this case study, we focus on face-to-face individual semi-structured interviews to local stakeholders. So we asked a total of 30 stakeholders to draw on print maps, as the one that you can see here in the right, the everyday life spaces that support the community interaction, and we prepare evaluative maps of community places from this data, and also the urban aspects in need of improvement. And we divided these urban aspects into world city issues and into issues of specific locations. So you can see here some of the pictures about the interviews with the 30 stakeholders. We interviewed a total of 30 people carrying out several activities like regional promotion, social welfare council members, also people related to children education and sightseeing promotion, also heritage protection and local art promotion. So with these interviews, we obtain a total of 365 everyday places that support community interaction, and around 300 of them are located inside the city boundaries and 47 of them outside the city boundaries. And we obtain also 454 urban aspects that need improvement. So 180 of them about world city issues and 254 of them about specific locations in the city. Regarding the everyday places that we locate, we categorize them into 9 categories. First, those meeting facilities especially designed for the encounter, and also educational and cultural facilities, shops and supermarkets, restaurants and cafes, sport facilities, green spaces, streets and open spaces, and others. And we represented with bigger or smaller cycles these kind of places regarding the number of respondents. So in the research area, we can find some places especially designed by the encounter, like the local city hall or the women's center, but the vast majority of the places that we found are more informal places, not designed for the encounter, like green areas located around religious buildings, informal green areas around the river, or private gardens and farms that support the social life. Also, several restaurants which have a community function, like the Manjo Udon or the Farmer Raku Cafe, shops, etc. So, from this map, we made 3 main findings. One was to check that above the meeting facilities like the community centers and other similar ones specifically designed by the encounter, other kind of informal places are more used by the respondents. So the most mentioned category were these kind of green spaces and small in-between green areas, like these informal spaces near the river, these kind of farms in well-connected areas, or these kind of small green areas between buildings. These were followed by shops in a 15% and by restaurants in a 10%. We also checked that some abandoned buildings were renovated into community places, and although the number of them is not so huge, it's only 2% of the places that we found, they have a very relevant role for the respondents' everyday life. So these only 2% places were mentioned by more than 30% of the respondents. And among them, we have, for example, this kind of vegetable selling market, the Cafe Raku, this kind of abandoned house renovated into a bakery in the mountains, or this abandoned school renovated into exhibition facility. We check also that these kind of apparently ordinary everyday community places are valued by the respondents above the city's most well-known landmarks. So in fact, 242 of the places that we discovered are not registered in the Tourist Association sites. Regarding the urban aspects that need improvement, we found 254 responses about specific locations in the city, so about shops that were abandoned, houses that were not well maintained, places that had garbage or unmaintained green areas. But the most interesting of them were those about whole city issues. So the most mentioned urban aspect, noted by 27 of the respondents, was the lack of a mid and long-term urban plan for the city and the lack of citizen consultation in this kind of urban and tourist plans. This was followed by the lack of spaces for the community and the difficulty for booking meeting spaces due to the limited opening hours. So in fact, for the 34 community centers in Minamiashigara, only 15% of them are usually being used. This is followed by the scarcity of transport services and the limited running hours for going to these community places, and the large amount of abandoned houses and vacant spaces which could be converted into community spaces. So 3 main findings that we made through this case study. The first one was to check again that this kind of informal community places have a very relevant role in the respondent social life. So actually, as I note, 76% of the places that we discover are not registered in the touring sites. In an outer peripheral area like Minamiashigara, these kind of spaces are related to informal green areas around the river, also these kind of farms in well-connected areas, or these kind of green areas between buildings. And these are followed by shops and restaurants to a lesser extent. So in this kind of outer peripheral area, these kind of informal spaces ameliorate the scarcity of formal meeting places. But these kind of places also face challenges, and in the case of this outer peripheral area of Minamiashigara, the main challenge is that most of these places can be only accessed by car since they are scattered in the territory. And also they face the lack of maintenance due to the scarcity of resources. But we also check how some of these abandoned spaces were revitalized by private owners into livable community facilities. We also check the demand by the respondents about revitalization programs that can be materialized into specific interventions in the city. So this was noted by the 90% of the respondents, and also the demand for formal community spaces and efficient use of the abandoned spaces in the city, noted by 27% of the respondents. So let's move to the last block of conclusion and the last chapter, the overall discussion and conclusion, which I will focus on 3 main points. First is to answer the research question. So can subjective perceptions be used to visualize community spaces in metropolitan peripheries? Then I will check the challenges that most of these places face and their potential to complement the bureaucratic approaches of master and revitalization plans. So first, through both case studies, we discovered a myriad of community places in Chōfu and in Minamiashigara, and we checked that the scarcity of formal meeting facilities is ameliorated in these case studies by a network of informal and ordinary community places. So, while the preliminary analysis allows us to check peripheral areas with similar demographic and morphological characteristics, the mapping subjective perceptions allow us to check the uniqueness of each case study. So in Chōfu, for example, by mapping subjective perceptions, we discovered these kind of places like the Niigai no Sato market, these kind of spaces under the highway, these kind of informal green areas near the river, or these bar alleys near the station, which are characteristic of a more compact urban fabric. While in the case of Minamiashigara, which is more scattered, the places that we found are more related to this kind of farmlands and also abandoned spaces renovated into community places like these ones. So when I speak about the uniqueness of each case, I refer to these kind of places in the sense that by mapping subjective perceptions, we can, even if Chōfu is usually preconceived as a bedroom town without a particular character or without a particular identity, by mapping this kind of subjective perception, we can find places that are not touristic landmarks, but still they are very rooted in the community. So, for example, this Niigai no Sato that we discovered in the center of the research area It was a wholesale market in the basement of a residential building opened in the 72, and it had 90 retailers in its peak. But as the role and the demand of the wholesale market was declining, the spaces of the market become more and more abandoned. Until 2005, where a real estate company reopened the market to the general public. So now it's directly selling local vegetables to the general customers in this supermarket and has another 20 additional shops like cafes, which community areas inside and co-working spaces like this one, also bakeries, flower shops, cram schools, barber shops, and snack bars, tiny snack bar like this one in the second floor of the building. So although the Jindaiji temple and other historic and touristic landmarks are part of Chōfu identity, this place and also other places that we discover through subjective perceptions, like the narrow bar alleys near the station and the urban farms, are also part of Chōfu identity and must be strengthened. So something similar happens with Minamiashigara. So although Minamiashigara is usually preconceived as an outer peripheral area developed around a single kind of industry, as many others in Japan and worldwide, by mapping subjective perceptions and by conducting the interviews, we hear about informal places and particularly about this campus Minamiashigara again and again. And after going to the place and see it, we check that it was an abandoned junior high school, which was opened in the 47 and closed in 2010 due to a lack of students and funds. So it was renovated into a community space by the former student and reopened in 2021. So the inner classrooms and some of the outer spaces has been renovated into exhibition facilities for displaying the local children artworks, as you can see some here. And the school fields were renovated into a camping area that becomes very lively during summer and during winter supports the neighbor residents' community activities. So here also, although the Dayusan temple and other kind of touristic landmarks are part of Minamiashigara character, these kind of places that we map through subjective perceptions are also part of the identity of the city that allow us to differentiate from other places. So with both case studies, we check that the preconception of metropolitan peripheries as places lacking community places and therefore social interaction and social involvement is a preconception. But we also check that this network of informal community places that we discover face also challenges. And these challenges are related to the low accessibility, which in Chōfu refers to some places being perceived as dangerous since they are near to roads with high-speed traffic or not illuminated, etc. And in Minamiashigara, it's difficult to access them without a car. And also the lack of maintenance. So these issues are aggravated by population decline and aging in the following decades. And this can create a very inconvenient environment for vulnerable groups like elders in the future. So we need to provide spaces in well-connected areas in order to fully support the residents' social life. And we can do so by providing community spaces through official plans, by revitalizing ordinary community places, and by renovating abandoned spaces. And by doing so, we can complement bureaucratic approaches. So in the case of Chōfu, for example, we discovered 13 abandoned buildings and 3 informal places in well-connected areas, which could be revitalized by following this approach. And it's something that is already happening in Minamiashigara. So in Minamiashigara, 7 abandoned buildings has been already revitalized into informal community places, and 2 of them are particularly popular because they are in well-connected areas like this Tenuto Cafe or this vegetable Farmer Raku Cafe. So by complementing bureaucratic approaches, I refer to, so in Japan, both in the growth and in the post-growth period, the bureaucratic approaches, what we call master plans, are not specific zoning operations inside the city as we can have in another Western context. They are more like strategic plans for orientating the planning efforts of the city to a particular direction. So in the growth period, the electric and railway corporations focus their efforts in the areas near the railway station and neglected to a lesser or further extent those far away areas. And this was something that the master plans in the 90s continue. But in the post-growth period, these kind of master plans are trying to revitalize broader areas of the city, make more comprehensive strategies to cover largest areas of the territory that were neglected before. But because these master plans are general strategies, they do not seek to propose specific interventions in the city fabric. So we can make the next step and complement these master plans with the spaces that we found through subjective perceptions. And by doing so, we can achieve plans that have a more close relationship with the particularities of the place and how it is perceived, and therefore a greater attachment and involvement of the local residents. So, for example, in the case of Chōfu, and the master plan of 2023 establishes a series of zones and revitalization bases, and our research area is located here in what the plan calls Central City Zone and Green Historical and Tourist Zone. So for the Central City Zone, the plan wants to develop the business character of the area, develop a livable station square, and exchange assets and a central base. While for the Green Historical and Tourist Zone, it seeks to promote the natural character of the area, revitalize the river, make a cliff axis and a green axis, going from east to west. So if we overlap the places that we identify through visitors and local perceptions, we can make the next step and complement these master plans in specific places of the city. So for example, in the central city area, of course, the area near the station square is relevant, but we could also consider other kind of places like these narrow bar alleys near to the station in order to improve the area livability. And in the northern Green Historical and Tourist Zone, in order to promote this natural character, we could also consider these kind of spaces that we found, like these urban farms scattered through the area and this Nigiwa Inosato market in the center. And in the case of this green axis crossing through the area, we could materialize also in these kind of places which are already attached by the community but face problems. And we also could consider these kind of spaces that we discover, these handcraft shops, to improve its historical character. And something similar happens with the case of Minamiashigara. So in the master plan that the city enacted in 2024, establishes three main goals. One is to create a compact urban structure with regional bases and efficient urban fabric maintenance. The second goal wants to establish a comfortable environment with greenery bases and promote the natural character of the area. And the third goal wants to attract vibrant industries, create industrial bases, and promote the agriculture. So if we overlap the spaces that we found through subjective perception, we can check that these regional bases that the plan is establishing coincide mostly with the places that we map. So we can give a special and a particular character to these bases through the spaces that we map through subjective perceptions by, for example, giving a character through this kind of green areas like the farms and the private gardens that are open to the community. Also, we could try to revitalize these underused and abandoned spaces in these regional areas into community spaces as the respondents were reclaiming, and also trying to give to these regional areas a particular character through these kind of community places with a special character like this campus Minamiashigara. So this thesis focused on the Tokyo metropolitan area in order to face the preconception of metropolitan peripheries as areas lacking community places and therefore social interaction and social involvement. And in the first chapter, we check about how fast metropolization leads to suburbanization and urban sprawl, and some of the issues of sprawl areas like the lack of formal community places which are aggravated by suburban decline. We also check how we can map community places by using subjective perceptions to place. In the second chapter, we check by the preliminary analysis of the Tokyo metropolitan area that we can distinguish between two kind of peripheral areas in Tokyo, inner and outer ones. And in the analysis block, we perform a case study analysis in two cities of the Tokyo metropolitan area. First, Chōfu in Tokyo, where we map visitors and local perspectives on places with positive and negative characteristics. And second, the case of Minamiashigara in Kanagawa, where we map the local perspectives on places that support the everyday life. In the discussion and conclusion, we check the network of the informal and ordinary community places that are supporting the social life of these peripheries, and also some of the challenges that they are facing, but also how to revitalize underused spaces in well-connected areas in order to solve these challenges. We also check how this kind of informal ordinary places can complement the bureaucratic approaches of master and revitalization plans. And in doing so, this kind of approaches can achieve a more significant relationship with the place and how it is perceived, and therefore a higher attachment and involvement of the local residents. So that's all for my presentation, and thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.